Welcome to AINdebrief, where we take a look back at the most important aviation stories of the past week by the AIN editors who covered them. I'm AIN Alerts editor Chad Troutvetter. In this week's episode, senior editor Curt Epstein gives an overview of the GAMA first quarter general aviation delivery data. Air transport editor Gregory Polek discusses the dim outlook for the Airbus A380. London-based editor Charles Alcock talks about EHang's commercial operations approval from the Chinese CAAC for its Model 216 eVTOL, EASA's pathway for eVTOL certification, and AeroTEC's first flight of an all-electric Caravan conversion. And editor-in-chief Matt Thurber explains new features that were added to the ForeFlight app, thanks to a new partnership with FlightAware. So Curt, GAMA released its first quarter numbers this week, and they're not great, but they're kind of okay, right?
Well, they're down in all categories, and we were long awaiting these numbers to come out. They were delayed by a little bit, and basically every segment's down.
But we kind of expected that, given the COVID shutdown and the pressure on suppliers and deliveries at OEMs, right? This wasn't a surprise.
It wasn't a surprise. As Pete Bunce wrote, the year started off well for the OEMs, but once the health and safety restrictions were put in place, it began to significantly impact their global operations, supply chains, and deliveries towards the end of the quarter. So, with that in mind, the numbers were not unexpected. You had business jet deliveries down in the first quarter year over year by about a little over 19%. Turboprops took a big hit, though. They were down about almost 42% year over year deliveries.
Yeah, and that's kind of surprising because turboprops right now are one of the best in the recovery here. So did they explain anything why those numbers are down? Is it just logistics, getting the airplanes delivered?
They didn't. I mean, Textron, which saw its deliveries basically halved, was one of the big points in that, and that's on both the jet side and the turboprop side. So maybe they are more impacted by supply chain disruptions, work disruptions, and things of that nature. There were some bright spots. You had Bombardier actually delivering 2 more aircraft than it did in the first quarter of 2019. You had Cirrus increasing its output. You had Pilatus increasing its output of the PC-24. So there were some good high spots.
And how did helicopters do?
Helicopters were down. They were down by about 18% also, for the turbine helicopters at least. Overall, the segment was down about 28%. And the billings slid by over 19%. Most of the OEMs were down. Airbus Helicopters now lumps all of its products together as far as commercial, military. They no longer differentiate by model, but once you combine all that together, they delivered 2 more units than they did in the first quarter of 2019. You had some other things. Robinson, their deliveries were down, but they managed to increase the number of R66s, the turbine-powered offering that they had in the first quarter of 2019.
So what is Pete Bunce, the head of GAMA, what did he have to say? What's the outlook for the rest of the year? Did he have anything to say about that?
Didn't say anything about the outlook, basically pointed to the resilience of these companies and how some of them managed to shift to production of PPE to keep their lines and equipment occupied and their workers occupied. And he says that, as he said, these actions are a testament to the adaptability and resilience of our industry's incredible workforce, who will play such a pivotal role in our recovery process.
Okay. Thanks, Curt. So, Greg, you had some news on the A380 from Airbus this week. It seems like a lot of airlines are starting to drop the model. Why is that?
Yeah, it's not really news, Chad, but as a matter of fact, the A380's heyday appeared over before the COVID crisis even hit, particularly after Emirates dropped an order for 39 airplanes, and that's right around. Well, that kind of forced Airbus to announce a wrap up to production. That's supposed to happen by 2021. I guess that means sometime this year. But of course, Emirates they operate about half of the fleet in the whole, the world's fleet. So that was a very important, significant development. Now that the COVID situation is here, and there are airlines that have made announcements about the fact that they're either going to delay returning the airplanes to service, or like in the case of Air France, they're going to get rid of their entire fleets. Right now, there's 3 airplanes, grand total of 3 airplanes flying in revenue service, and they're with China Southern. The COVID situation is pretty much, it's really accelerated an already bad situation for the A380.
So there's about 200 A380s in service. Is that about right?
Yeah, a little bit more than that, I believe. Emirates has about 115. Emirates has been kind of sending. This week or the last couple of weeks sent a bit of a mixed message about what their plans are. A couple of weeks ago, Emirates President Tim Clark made a comment saying that both the A380 and the 747 are over, basically, and that did not sit well with some people, I guess. And a couple of weeks later, he kind of sounded a little less pessimistic and said that the fleet will basically remain intact at the airline, but a lot of the airplanes won't come back until 2021 or 2022, I think. So there is going to be a delay in returning a lot of them to service. And of course, as Emirates is the biggest operator of these airplanes, it's really reflective of the wider kind of problem it's seeing.
Yeah, and the airplane's not that old, right? It's about 13 years old, I think, since they first entered service, right?
Yeah, it was 2007 with Singapore Airlines. Recently, or I guess last year or late last year, I'm not sure exactly when, but Singapore retired the first of 2 that have now left the fleet. One of them is parted out, I believe, because there's just not a secondary market for the airplane now.
So what happens to the airplanes that don't go back into service? Do they get parted out? Do they get refit for freight service? What's going to happen to them?
It's hard to say. I don't think they're really appropriate for freighter conversion. The lease rates are they started out very high when the airplane first came out. And the encumbered lease rates, meaning the airplanes that still have lease terms attached to them, are still pretty high. Once they come off lease, which will make them what they call naked airplanes, those lease rates are going to fall quite a bit. And whether that results in people taking the airplane, more people taking the airplane, it's hard to say, but like I said, the secondary market has kind of disappeared for the airplane. There's really no one who's interested in picking up used A380s.
Right, and no U.S. airlines operate through A380s as well, right?
No, that's right, yeah.
So not a good outlook for the airplane. Interesting. All right, thanks, Greg.
You're welcome.
So let's hop over to Charlie. Hi, Charlie. We're going to talk about EHang and some eVTOL developments in Europe. So tell us about EHang. They have a Model 2, I believe it's a Model 216. It's not certified yet, but they got approval from China to operate it for a hotel. So how does that work?
Yeah, well, that's a good point. How does it work? And I've been trying to make sense of that. So EHang, as I've reported before, is a true pioneer in this electric vertical takeoff and landing field that I'm following. They have been developing what is essentially a 2-seater model called the 216. It can carry 2 people and fly them autonomously, but it can also carry freight. And essentially what's been happening is that EHang is working very, very closely with the Civil Aviation Administration of China. It started a trial program about the beginning of 2019 to do some trial operations, and nobody really batted an eyelid at that. But then this week, the Chinese authorities have said, sure, yeah, just carry on and keep operating this thing. And now you can do it commercially, meaning for money. You can start carrying stuff for money for customers. And I don't really understand how this works. The aircraft itself does not have a type certificate. It's still basically in development. It's still basically in flight testing. And yet the Chinese authorities are apparently comfortable with some, preliminary commercial operations. The first customer is actually going to be a hotel group. And for whatever reason, it's going to pay EHang to do things like carrying guests' luggage and go collect groceries and things like that. I mean, it seems very curious, but essentially it's part of their flight development program.
Yeah, the hotel also has plans to do passenger flights too, I think, at some point.
Yes, they do. That's the next step. Now, so far, the Chinese authorities have not said you can fly passengers for hire, but who knows? Maybe that will come next. A few months ago, EHang announced a provisional agreement with another Chinese hotel group to build so-called eVTOL tourist hotels that will offer various types of sightseeing. So, I think what's happening here is EHang, and you've got to give it to them, they're pretty resourceful. They're developing not only the aircraft, but all these sort of new business models that nobody's ever thought of before for using these aircraft. And, when you talk to them, they basically just nod their head and say, yeah, don't worry about it. Eventually the type certificate will be there. And that just seems to be their modus operandi. Now, keep in mind, this is a NASDAQ-listed company. It until recently certainly had plans to introduce service into the United States. At the same time, it's got plans to introduce service in Europe and other parts of the world. And their attitude just seems to be, we will push ahead and do whatever the authorities in any part of the world will allow us to do. And, that's basically their plan.
So let's talk about certification, but in a different region. So EASA in Europe has put some rules out about certification for eVTOL. So what's that?
Yes, it has done. This week on Monday, it introduced proposed means of compliance for its so-called special condition VTOL document. Now, this is such a contrast with what's happening in China. EASA is very much, the European Aviation Safety Agency, very much behind the development of eVTOL aircraft. It's very supportive, but it's following a much more conservative, systematic, some would say rigorous path to allowing this to happen. So last July, it introduced this special condition VTOL, which basically set the groundwork for a whole new category of aircraft that would, be electrically powered and potentially operate autonomously. And the weight limit for that is 7,000 pounds. But then they subsequently consulted on the means of compliance for the electric power plants. That was, I think, in February of this year, they started doing that. And now they're consulting on the full means of compliance for this, for getting type certification under these rules. And that consultation period is open through the 24th of July. And then around November of this year, EASA says, well, we'll probably be ready then to publish essentially the full guidelines for getting an aircraft certified. And that will be pretty significant because although the FAA is also doing work in this area, my understanding is the FAA hasn't quite got so far in clearly mapping out exactly how these things are going to be handled from a regulatory point of view.
So Europe seems to be leading the way on a certification pathway, right?
I think they are, yes, in terms of giving manufacturers a sort of fairly clear path and timeline for what they can do. I think they are leading the way. But I think you can expect to see pretty similar from the FAA in the US this year as well.
Well, speaking of the US and electric airplanes, on Thursday, Magnix had a first flight of a Caravan fitted with one of their electric engines. How did that go?
Yeah, well, it seems to have gone well. The flight happened on Thursday. And just to be clear, Magnix is a company that develops electrical propulsion systems. It's not an aircraft manufacturer as such. It's partnered with a company called AeroTEC to essentially re-engine the Cessna Grand Caravan with an electric-based propulsion system. It's a 750 horsepower motor and propeller combination. And it took off for this first flight from an airport in Moses Lake, Washington, which is a place that many of you will know is quite commonly used for aircraft development work. It flew for 30 minutes. That doesn't sound like much, but remember, this has an electric engine, electric battery, so it is actually pretty significant that they flew even that long. We're waiting to find out a little bit more about exactly what the next steps are for this program. It's not totally clear, when these partners are going to have something ready for the market. But this follows on the footsteps of some work that Magnix did back in December 2019 with a Vancouver-based operator, an airline really, called Harbour Air, and they flew an electric version of the DHC-2 Beaver seaplane. And in fact, Harbour Air have told me they're still flight testing that and apparently fully intend to electrify their whole fleet. So, this is part of this electric aviation revolution that many people, including me, are getting so excited about.
There's a lot to watch here. Thanks, Charlie. Matt, let's go over to you. ForeFlight and FlightAware joined forces this week, and they're making ForeFlight better. So tell us about that.
Yes, you're right, Chad. ForeFlight released a new version of its electronic flight bag app on Tuesday. And one of the big new features, in addition to multitasking capability, is internet traffic. So when you're connected to the internet, you can see both ground and air traffic pretty much anywhere in the world. And this is powered by FlightAware's network of nearly 30,000 ADS-B receivers located all over the world.
So what advantage does this give the pilot during, obviously on the ground, it will be during flight planning. So what advantage does this give them?
So during flight planning, you can now look at your departure and destination airport and get some useful information. For example, you can see which runway is being used for takeoff and landing. You can actually also see which departure and arrival procedures are being used. So you can know pretty much what your flight plan is going to have to look like. But another big advantage is if there's, say, a big weather event happening somewhere on your route, you'll be able to see the airplanes curving around that weather so you can see how it's affecting your route. It's kind of an interesting, useful feature, but it's also kind of fun to watch too.
So also the multitasking is pretty interesting as well, because it helps to allow pilots to run other applications while they're using ForeFlight, right?
Exactly. I love the new multitasking feature. It means you can run ForeFlight side by side with other multitasking capable apps on your iPad. So, for example, the demonstration that they used was to show ForeFlight running on the right side, and then you pull up Apple's clock app on the left side and use its countdown timer to time an instrument approach. And I tried this yesterday on my X-Plane desktop simulator, flying an approach into McCord Field near Tacoma, Washington, and using the timer in a multitasking pane to time the approach from the final approach fix down to the runway. It was pretty cool because the timer numbers are nice and big. They're really easy to see. You're not looking for a clock. It's right in front of you. And it's a great new feature.
Now, you talked to both FlightAware and ForeFlight. Did they have any other hints about what might be coming to ForeFlight in the future with this partnership, or what might be coming to ForeFlight later on?
It's interesting because ForeFlight is usually really careful not to give anybody a heads up on what's coming. Although this particular case, they did preview the multitasking feature a couple of weeks before it was released. The FlightAware feature wasn't announced until it actually came out. But both Daniel Baker from FlightAware and Tyson Ways from ForeFlight agreed that there's more interesting things coming from the partnership, but they wouldn't tell us what.
All right, thanks, Matt. Thanks for listening to AINdebrief. Another podcast episode will air next Friday. In the meantime, go to www.ainonline.com for the latest aviation news from AIN.